Okay, hey everybody. I think we start. We already have some delay, and I hope to send you back to the coffee break on time. So my name is Simon Martinelli, and I'm talking about Hibernate. No, I will not talk about Hibernate. I will talk about an alternative to Hibernate and try to compare it with Hibernate. Maybe some words about myself. I started software development in 1995. That's already quite a while. I was programming in COBOL, and I was using SQL in that time. So I learned SQL before programming, more or less, or together, how you would name it. And I moved to the Java environment in year 2000. I'm teaching at the university. I was in some Java specification request expert groups, and I'm an active member in the Java user group in Switzerland. That means I'm from Switzerland, and that's where my ugly accent is coming from. And I also often talk about Vaadin. Vaadin is something that we don't see today, but I have a hobby. I do something else when I'm not working on software, and I'm in a sports club. I'm a sports club in my hometown, a very small sports club, and we do track and field. And when I was younger, so in 1997, we also had events or competitions that were organized for kids. So we usually have around 100 kids that come to an event. And in these days, we had a list, and we had to calculate the points based on the result, and we were around 10 people in the office who tried to calculate the points. It takes a while. It was very error-prone to do that. And so I was just starting software development, and I thought, hey, that's a good use case. I could create an application. So the first one was Excel. I used with Visual Basic for Applications. Maybe someone remembers that time. Then later on, I moved to Access. And when I moved to Java, I said, hey, that's a good idea to move my application there. So the application that I'm showing you today is already like 25 years old or older, but it has still the same data model in the back end, but it has a completely different UI, and that's why I'm also using or talking about Vaadin, because for this application in particular I'm currently working on with Vaadin, and it's the version 4. So if you're interested in track and field or in doing such competitions, you can go to jtaf.ch. It's open source. You can find the code on GitHub, and you can have a look how this works. So to start, maybe before we see some code, I'd like to show you the data model. That's a very simple one, by the way. We have on top an organization, so that's usually the club that organizes the event. And then under the organization, we have the athletes, so we can do some reporting during the time if, for example, the athlete gets better or not, and something like that. And very often we have clubs, so that's not limited to clubs, because one of the events that we doing in my hometown for the kids, it's for all school kids. So they don't have to be in the sports clubs. It's more like marketing for our club to get new members. And so the club is usually not mandatory. And on the other hand, we have series. Series means you can have multiple competitions that then will be reported in a single ranking list on the series. So people that are into track and field may know Diamond League. That's also a series that has multiple competitions in Zurich, in Rome, and in other places, and we'll have a final ranking list. And then we have some categories. We will see that. And the athletes then starts in a certain category with an event. The event is, for example, 80-meter sprint or long jump or high jump or something like that. And there also lies the business logic, so we have to calculate the points. That's the only business logic really in the whole application. The rest is just CRUD. So we have to manage the data here. And that's also what I like to talk to you today about CRUD or CRUD-like applications. So this is how the application today looks like. And that's a dashboard. You can see here we had the last competition last Saturday morning. That's really fresh. And this is also a view that everybody can see, so the participants can have a look at the mobile phone and see their results. But the management part is in a protected area where you can manage, like, for example, the series with the competitions here. You see the categories, and on the categories we also see like what events are here, so 80 meters long jump and so on. And ABC, these are the parameters for the formulas to calculate the points finally. So that's not very interesting, but what's interesting here is that we display data in tables. Who of you has exactly such applications that the only purpose is to display data in tables, and if I click here, edit the data in a form? Do we have such applications here? Right, so usually if we talk, we heard a lot of talks about domain-driven design, and usually this is the supporting domain. So you often have a core domain where all the business logic is, like an order management system, but you also have like a product management system, a customer management system, and these are more or less CRUD applications. So the point is that in such application types, you may not need a complex domain model or nested elements. So that means if we go back to our model here, we don't need to have like what's called persistence by reachability. So we don't want to save the organization and it should save all the dependent parts of the organizations. We just manage the data that comes from a single table usually. Yeah? The interesting thing about my application is I also use nested structures, and the nested structure that I have here may be obvious. I create a ranking list, and this is a PDF that is generated, and this is a tree. So we have a competition, we have categories, so we have here the boys or the girls later, and in each category we have the participants, and the participants has results from the various events where they were running or jumping or whatever they did. So this is a tree, and now the question is how I load the tree. But we will see that in a minute. So what I like to talk to you about today is, should we use Hibernate, so JPA, or jOOQ? I will come to jOOQ and tell you what jOOQ in detail is. But we have a conceptual difference between these two. We have one approach that is JPA. So we have what I call persistence by reachability. This was also the idea of the object-oriented database back in the days, or JDOs, if there are people that remember these days. And we usually have kind of an entity state transition. So we load an entity, we manipulate the data, either directly or with some business logic that does the state transition. And then we have a framework like Hibernate that checks what has changed and updates the database, the underlying database. And that's the idea of these OR mapping frameworks. On the other hand, like you do such applications that I've shown you before, you will work on a database table. So you don't need all the dirty checking or whatever, because you just load the data in memory, you display it. Often you do dynamic paging, so you need some paging mechanism there, because you don't want to load 1,000 or 10,000 of records of data in the UI. And then you have usually a data binding, someone enters the data, and then you want to update the data in the database, or you want to delete the record or whatever. And especially for deletion, you don't need to load the data, you can simply execute the delete statement. Now the point is, there is none of these approaches is the best. So it really depends what you are doing. So are you doing more like an order management system with complex logic, or are you doing a product management system where you just want to edit the data that is in the database? And in my case, it's the later, so I really want to just manage the data in the database. Now the problem that you have if you want to use SQL directly in Java, you have to use strings. So with multi-line strings, it's a bit better today. So you don't have to concatenate the string. You can have multi-line strings, and you even have support from the IDE. So for example, if you use IntelliJ, you have call completion if you have a data source attached, and it checks if you write the correct SQL statement. But that's just at the development time. So later on, if you change the database, you will have problems with that approach because your SQL will no longer run, probably. And that's the idea of jOOQ. jOOQ generates Java code from your database. So we have a database first approach. We create a database, usually with something like Flyway or Liquibase to have database migrations. And then we generate the code. We get a meta model. By the way, if you use JPA, you may know already that approach because JPA also generates a meta model. With that, you can use in Criteria API to make type-safe queries, for example. And that's more or less the same approach, but what's different is you will then have a Fluent API, and it's called a DSL, a domain-specific language, and this DSL in jOOQ is SQL. So we write SQL statements with Java as Java code. Now, where do we start? And there is for sure jOOQ.org, that's the official documentation. There is also a demo from jOOQ directly. And for this talk, I created a GitHub project, jOOQ examples. And that's what I will show you before. And then we also will dig into the special feature that I've shown you before with the ranking list to show you how it's possible to read such data in a very efficient manner without overhead. So as I told you, database first is the key concept of jOOQ, so you have to create the database. But the good thing is jOOQ doesn't assume anything in the database. So it doesn't assume that you follow some rules or naming conventions or a structure or whatever, because jOOQs can use any database. So most of the SQL databases are supported by jOOQ. And on the other hand, you are completely free, even if you want to use stored procedures or functions in the database. So if you have maybe a legacy database that you have to maintain, often there are stored procedures. So I think these days there are less projects that use stored procedures anymore, but I have, for example, a customer that is building an ERP product, and we have like 2,000 database tables there and around 5,000 stored procedures. And so the whole business logic of this application is there. And the good thing, and I will not show you that today because we don't have enough time, jOOQ generates a Java class per stored procedure. So that means calling a stored procedure with jOOQ feels like using a Java class. So you don't have to use the callable statement of JDBC. If you already tried to execute the stored procedure in the database, that is much, much easier. So how does jOOQ work? jOOQ has two parts. So first of all, it has the DSL I was already talking about, and we will see that. And on the lower part of the picture, you see a jOOQ generator, and that's the generator that takes the database and generates Java classes. You can have multiple different jOOQ generators. You can have a DDL generator. That means you can use your Flyway or Liquibase scripts and generate the model for jOOQ from the SQL scripts. The problem with that approach is that's a bit limited because it doesn't support everything that the database supports. So if you have stored procedures, for example, this will not work. This will just work for tables, indexes, views, or other database objects that you may use. So it's probably better to use directly the database. Now the problem is, where does this database come from? So sometimes I have customers that have like a reference database that is running somewhere, and we use jOOQ to generate from this reference database. But today we have a better approach. We have test containers. So the easiest way, or the most convenient way, is to use test containers to spin up your database. Then you can apply the Flyway or Liquibase scripts, and when this is done, you can generate the code from this test containers database. So this is a very good approach, and even test containers recognize that as a good approach, and they created a jOOQ Flyway test containers plugin. It's version 0.0.1 because it was released like 2 days ago, and this encapsulates that, because if you have to do that by hand, you need something like a Groovy plugin, maybe in Maven, to spin up the test container, and that's not a nice solution. So test containers created a convenient plugin that you can use for this very common use case when you use test containers together with jOOQ. So that's something very good. We will see both approaches when I show you the code of my application. So this leads me to go to the application code. And first, we will have a look at this example application. So I use Maven, by the way. I use Maven because I prefer Maven over Gradle, because for me it's simpler to use, but it also has another reason. From jOOQ you only get official Maven plugin. There is a Gradle plugin that works. It's even from Etienne Studer from Gradle who created the plugin, but the preferred way, or maybe the easier way because of the configuration, is following the Maven plugin ID, because if you can run jOOQ generations also without Maven plugin, so it's not limited. You can even generate the meta model directly from Java if you like to, or you could use a CLI that uses an XML file for the configuration, and because of this XML file, that fits perfectly into a POM, because POM is also XML. You just can use the same thing there. So we have this jOOQ CodeGen plugin, and we bind the execution to a phase and use generate, and here you can see that I use this so-called DDL database. So in my small example, I use an H2DB and generate directly the meta model from the SQL scripts that are here on the DB migration, so the standard path for Flyway scripts. And I can define that it should be sorted as Flyway would sort it, because Flyway uses the version names or the file names. And then I can use a target package name where I want to generate that. And then the question is, do we put the generated code under version control or not? And this really depends. It really depends mostly on the size of the project. So you can imagine we have 2,000 tables, 4,000 and something stored procedures, and we create or we generate 8,500 Java classes from our database in that ERP system. And the generation is not a problem. That runs quite fast, but the problem is the compilation. So the whole process is about 7 or 8 minutes, so you don't want to do that if you check out the application and then you have to wait 8 minutes until you can start from scratch. So there maybe it's better to either put it under version control. What we do, we create a separate project that will be in the main repo, and we reference that as a regular dependency. In my case, I always create that from scratch. And if you do that, then you will get the source code in the target directory. There is the default generated sources directory, and here we have a folder called jOOQ. And in jOOQ, we will find some information about the database here. By the way, jOOQ has support for, I would say, every database in a way. So for most common databases like Postgres, MariaDB, Oracle, and so on, there is a special generator. So it uses the system tables of the databases for the meta model to generate the data. And if you have a database that has a JDBC driver but is not officially supported by jOOQ, you can use the JDBC standard way to generate that, and it really uses this result set metadata and so on to generate this code. The interesting part of this generation is the tables package, and here we see that for each table we get a class. Now we also get some classes that we haven't seen before, so there's a category event, category athlete. These are the relationship tables that are used because we have like end-to-end relationships that we didn't see in the model. And what happens, or what contains these classes contain some information about the table. So they have a table with the name as a constant, and these constants you will use when you build type-safe SQL statements. So you can use that like you would do if you have a JPA meta model with criteria API. You can use this to make type-safe queries. And if you look at like the first name, for example, here we have a table field that has some types. I will come to the record in a minute. So this one is of type string, And we also have additional information. So we, for example, have the SQL data type, the length, we know if it's nullable or not. And if I wouldn't be lazy and add comments to my database schema, because you can document your database schema, by the way, you can add comments to the table, to the columns. And if I would do that, jOOQ will take that and put it here. And you would even see it when you use call completion, would you see a Javadoc comment on the database field, for example, or column, if you want to use that. There are many more information about like which is the primary key, are there unique keys, what are the foreign keys. And the point is we don't have dependencies between the classes. So if you go ahead with JPA, you will map one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many relationships. Here we just have like the database table without anything else, but we know what are the foreign keys. Now, if you want to work with that, the question is, what is the result of a query? And if you go ahead and select like all columns from an athlete, for example, then you can have the result as an athlete record in my case. And this extends here the updatable record input. That means the athlete record is kind of an active record. So that means I can read it from the database, change the state, and finally call store, and it will update my database table. It will even provide optimistic locking if I like to. And that's quite convenient. So if you remember the form to edit, for example, the category, then I just use this record directly in the UI to bind. So I have kind of very few layers in my application. I have a data access layer, some business logic maybe in between, but the rest is all UI logic that glues everything more or less together. So now that's what we see when we have a look at the generated code. Now see some code. I created here a very small test, and thanks to the talk of Philip yesterday, I changed something because I was aware of that, but I simply forget. There is even a jOOQ test annotation. So this is a test layer, or a test slice, not a layer, test slice that just starts what jOOQ needs to run the tests. Before I had Spring Boot test. By the way, it doesn't really matter in my case because I just have jOOQ as a dependency and the database driver and some test containers, but that's more or less it. Now, if you want to work with jOOQ, you can use this DSL context. So that's more or less the main class. It's comparable to the entity manager or the Hibernate session. That does the heavy lifting. So this executes the statements. And this also has kind of, we will see that when we use records, this has kind of a similar model because with entity manager and JPA you have this persistent context and you have the entities either in the state managed or detached. And with jOOQ it's more or less the same. If you read the data via record, then the record becomes attached. You can immediately change it and store it. And if it's detached for some reason, then this will not work. So that's quite similar what JPA does. So here we have the simplest query that you could do. We simply select from the table competition. This select from is a shortcut because usually we would use select and then from. But if I want to read all the columns from the table, I can use select from, and this will result in returning a whole record. So now I have this competition record, or I have a list of competition records. By the way, result is a jOOQ collection that extends list. So it is sorted because all results from a SQL statement are always sorted. If you don't use order by, then it's sorted how the database thinks that could be sorted. Or you can use order by. That's why result is used as a list. And then you can use that if you want to. Here we have some insert statement where you can specify the columns, you can specify the values. And here I have a special returning result method call because I want to get back the ID because my ID is generated via a sequence, but as a default value on the table, for example, and I want to get back the ID. But the question is if you really want to use that to insert data. So if you have a large table with a lot of columns, this may be a bit verbose to do it like that, and that's why you can use this updatable record here, and you can create a new one. So the DSL new record there is used that jOOQ knows about this created athlete record, so that it becomes attached from the beginning. And then I set the name and the first name to Mujinga Kambunji, by the way, is the fastest woman in Switzerland. She's the fastest woman in Switzerland in the whole time. So she's a very good sprinter. And if we have done that, we can also set like the foreign keys. That's what I was talking before. So we don't have like a relationship to club or a relationship to the organization. We just have the foreign keys. That depends if you like it or not. I mean, I was in a talk this morning of Oliver Trotbaum, and he was showing a framework to check domain-driven code style with, and there you have usually the aggregate root, and in that case, club and organization probably will not be part of the aggregate root, and you even wouldn't have that even if you use JPA in that case. So. And then I can call store, and we have just store. We don't have update and insert. We have store, and store knows if this is a new record, and it creates an insert, or either case it would create an update. Now that's more or less straightforward how you do that. Interesting is when you use projection. So in my case here, I want to just have the first name, the last name, and the club name of an athlete. And in that case, I have created a DTO. The DTO here is a Java record. And Java record, by the way, is a perfect fit for jOOQ because projection is always read-only. So you don't want to change that data in a way. And there we really have benefit from this record because the syntax is very short and it can directly be used. And for that, jOOQ has a fetch-in-to. Fetch-in-to is more or less straightforward. jOOQ checks if there is a default constructor and that or a constructor to instantiate the class that matches the attributes or the columns that we have here in the projection. There is also other possibility. If you don't have a constructor, then it will use reflection and fill out or fill the object state. Or you could even have a mapper and do the mapping yourself. So you could more or less map everything. So you can use that directly. And here we select that in this DTO. And maybe it's interesting what would happen if I just call fetch without that. So first of all, you see that's type safe because it's also generics, or it uses extensively generics. So the result now is a complete different type, and we see here in the error message it expected the result from record 3 with 3 strings. jOOQ has record 1 to record 22. Yeah, if you have 23 columns, you have to find another solution, but usually you don't want to do that. So it has a record, and the cool thing about that, that's type safe. So I can use the record then. The difference that we have here, if I use a record, so I can change that here. Oops, take that away. Now this doesn't work here below, right? Because this has no method called first name. And the question is now, how do I access the data? I could use an index, like you do when you have a result set with JDBC, but that's more or less a stupid idea because indexes could change, and the question is it 1-based, is it 0-based, is it 22-based? Who knows? And for that, you can use the same mechanism as we do in the projection. Here in the select statement, we simply use the attribute name or the generated code to access this data. And even here, because this first name is a string, if I change this first name, for example, to a number, which doesn't make sense, but I could do that, then my code will no longer compile because the type will no longer match. So let's get back that to what it was before. Now we see here something we have to join. So the benefit of JPA, if we have a mapping, we don't have to write joins, right? We have to write joins if we have a one-to-many relationship, but we don't have to join on something. We just write join, and then it knows how to do the join. jOOQ has something similar added lately. It's called implicit join, because all the to-one relationships are relatively easy to find out on the database tables how they look like, and so you can do that shorter. And that means that jOOQ generates like a method for tables that have a one-to-one relationship, and then you can navigate from athlete to club and then directly to an attribute of that type. That's quite convenient, because writing joins is usually a bit annoying, so you have to join that. There are various ways to join. You can join on, you can use join using, or you even could use natural join. Does somebody know what a natural join on a database is? That's what I thought. In early days, people tend to name or prefix all columns or most of the columns. So for example, my athlete has an ID, and like 30 years ago, somebody made it call athlete_ID. That's for the primary key. And then if I use a reference to the athlete, I call the foreign key also athlete_ID. And then I use natural join and say the database, hey, just join by the same names. Is this a good idea? What do you think? Maybe, maybe not. Often not, because what happens if both tables have another attribute that has the same name, then it will use that again or also for the join, and you will get results that are maybe not what you expected. That's often a problem. And then finally we have a delete statement. By the way, we also have an update statement. I just didn't add it because this is obvious, but we also have a delete statement to delete the data. Now that's straightforward, right? That's not very fancy or whatever. The fancy thing comes when I use or show you the code to generate the ranking list. Because if I had JPA for that, I would have like a competition that has a one-to-many relationship to categories, one-to-many relationship to athletes, and a one-to-many relationship to results, for example. And even if I do a join fetch or an entity graph annotation, then I will get the product, and I will get too much data, because I will get redundancy in the result, because every row that I get back has the data from all these tables, or depending what I want to select. jOOQ uses a new feature, or not new feature, a feature that most of the databases today provide. But let's have first a look at the query that generates the ranking list. So we have a select with name, competition date, and so on. And then we have something that doesn't exist in SQL. We have a multiset. By the way, doesn't exist is not entirely true, because the SQL standardization group is talking about adding nested structure as results from SQL queries. But here we don't have that, but jOOQ can do that. So we have a multi-select, and then we have an inner select that uses the columns from the category table. Then we have again a multi-select with the athlete, and a multi-set finally with the result. And then we have what I told you before about converting. Then we have a converter method. We get every record in this method, and we can map like the result to some class. Here we have this competition ranking data, and I used inner records in that class, because otherwise I would get some naming conflicts. And if you look at the data here, we exactly have that. So we have a competition ranking data with a list of categories. Then we have a category finally with a list of athletes. And the athletes finally have some, what do we have here? A list of results. And with this multi-set and converting mechanism, I can do that in exactly one SQL statement. That's a great thing. But the best thing about that, it just creates one SQL statement, because maybe with JPA you will get multiple. And the question is how jOOQ does that. jOOQ uses JSON functionality from the database. So let's have a look at where we are, like here. Sorry. Where is my debug console? And I try to see if I find it. Oops. I clear the console, maybe. Let's do it like this. Some more space. So let's do that again. Click on the competition ranking. And here we see that it generates this query, right? So jOOQ is relatively sophisticated when it comes to logging. It logs the SQL statement, and it also produces kind of a, I have to turn that off, kind of a table with the first few records, just that you can see if it worked or not. And the good thing about this logging, it logs the statement in two variations, because jOOQ is by default safe against SQL injection, because it uses prepared statements, but logging prepared statements is not a good idea, because you will only see question marks instead of the real parameters. So jOOQ inlines the parameters to display it in the log statement. So you can directly copy the query to like a SQL console and execute it there, and that's very, very handy. So what happens here? First you see there is a table as a result. That's the competition with the name and competition date and so on. And then we have the multiset. And here in the multiset included is JSON data. So that's data that's, it's not JSON because it has no double quotes, but it's kind of JSON data, and jOOQ uses that data that is a tree to map it to the result that we have. So we read much less data even if we would do it with a regular join where we have like a product of the result. That's some of the features that jOOQ provide. Here, by the way, I talked about it earlier, the test containers mechanism in like the ugly way before test containers created the plugin. So here I spin up a Postgres container, and then I set the property of the DB URL in the Maven context, that I can use this information here in the Flyway DB to migrate or to execute the migrations. And finally, jOOQ uses the same DB parameters to generate the jOOQ code. And this is done now in a single plugin. You just have to specify which test containers version you need and where are your Flyway scripts, and then you're done. And that's much easier now with the help of this test containers plugin. Now we have jOOQ and we have JPA, and the point is we don't have to decide which one to use, right? Because in my opinion, both of them have kind of a superpower. So jOOQ's superpower is querying. So if you have to write complex queries, and something I didn't told you, jOOQ is database agnostic. So jOOQ works with every database, and the SQL statements are the same that you write with the jOOQ DSL. jOOQ will translate them in the dialect of the used database, like Hibernate is doing that as well. But you can use all the features. You can even use features that are not implemented in the database you're using. jOOQ does some emulation to make that work as well. So you can change the database, but no one wants to change the database. That's probably, for other reasons, not the best idea. Then what I showed you is, for me, really the superpower of jOOQ, reading nested objects and thinking about, that's a point for some reporting, but thinking about REST APIs. So if you build REST APIs, you often have the need to read nested DTOs. And with that mechanism, you can directly do that with jOOQ. You don't need to read JPA entities, then use model mapper or mapstruct and map it to a DTO and send the DTO to the client. You can directly create the DTO with jOOQ. And for sure, calling function and store procedure, that's something maybe is interesting for people that are using legacy databases or have people in the team that really know well how to create SQL store procedures, for example. And for sure, bulk updates and deletes, because that simply works and you just want to use SQL statement and not read entities to delete them, because that doesn't make really sense. On the other hand, we have JPA superpower. That's for sure the entity state transition. So if you really have a model and you want to read the model, modify the model, also all the cascading with insert, update, delete, or even orphan removal, if you remove something from a collection with JPA and it detects that and removes this orphan from the database, that's really a good thing. So in my opinion, you can use without any problem both in the same application. Simply choose the best parts of the frameworks. And in my opinion, using JPA or Spring Data JDBC for executing SQL is not a good idea, because you have to use strings. You have strings all over the place in your application, and if the database changes, you have to write a lot of tests. By the way, you should do tests, right? I don't say you shouldn't test. But with jOOQ, you will get the compile time error, not a runtime error. And that's the best part, in my opinion, about using jOOQ, because it will be type safe and it will be compile time checked. That's very important. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes for questions, if there are some. Yes?
So what if you want to use native typing models like JSONB? You can write queries to use the postless JSONB operator and simply that?
Yep. Yeah. jOOQ even provides JSON and XML functionality directly. The question is then if the database supports that. So the multiset that I've shown you before doesn't work, for example, with H2. Because H2 has no JSON functionality that is needed for that. Yeah.
I was going to ask if there is a tool that you use for translating the SQL or the DSL coding to SQL and vice versa before you compile and run the code.
No, not really.
Before?
No, but jOOQ has like a tool that you could generate from one SQL standard to another. So if you have really the need to move from one database to another, you can use the DB2 query and convert it to an Oracle query. By the way, you can also execute SQL statements directly with jOOQ. So jOOQ has a method fetch, and there you can pass the SQL string. That's sometimes handy, because if you have like people in the team that know SQL very well, they may provide you predefined SQL statement that you just can use. And there, such a tool would be great that translates the string to the DSL, but that does not exist. So in that case, you just use the string and run it. So we have some, in one project, we have DBAs that provide the query. We put it in a SQL file, and we load the SQL file from the class path and pass it to jOOQ and execute it. Yeah.
Got it, thank you.
Thank you for the talk, it was great. How closely coupled to the database's specific types are the generated DSL classes? If you move between two similar ones?
Yeah, it depends. So the point is, usually you are not. So, I mean, there is the JDBC conversion table in the JDBC spec that defines which SQL types should match which Java types. And jOOQ also have an opinion on that. So it depends if you have like a text column type or something like that, then jOOQ knows that's probably a string or something like that. Dependent it will be if you use UDTs, user-defined types. And I was in this domain-driven design talk this morning, and the guys from domain-driven design, if they do that with Java, they usually create like something like, what was the idea from Oliver, it was creating an email address as a type. That's a problem, because in Java we don't have an alias to create an email address as a string, so we have to create the class. And if you map that to a database schema, you could go ahead and define types for every attribute that you have, and then you will get an email address as a user type in your Java class, and then you're very close to a domain-driven design made of the functionality of a SQL database. Maybe I have to have a talk about that once, because this was just an idea this morning. Because I have customers that use a lot of user-defined types. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I wondered if you actually also had a look at place persistence, because I think that's somewhere in between JPA and jOOQ.
Yeah, I can say something to place persistence because I know the developer. He moved to Hibernate. He's now in the Hibernate core team, and a lot of place persistence will probably be integrated in Hibernate. So they have something called entity views, so you have read-only stuff, and that's a very good feature in my opinion, because it also can read nested data without defining a lot of stuff. And probably this will come in a future Hibernate version. But with jOOQ, you really have SQL. So you just use SQL as it is, and you don't have anything, or you don't want to use anything else, probably. Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Hi. Also, thanks for the talk. I have actually two questions. The first one is if jOOQ supports asynchronous communication with the database, so webflux and non-blocking calls.
Yep. Yes.
Yes, okay.
So jOOQ also has support. It's called R2DBC. It's the reactive database driver that most database products support, and jOOQ has support for that. So you can fetch a stream or a flux, and then you get really a flux back from jOOQ. Yeah.
Okay, and the second question, how would it work if I need a join both in my select statement and in my result set? So for example, I join two large tables, want to select a joined column and also specifically return the joined column in the result set. Would that result in two separate joins in the query? Or is there a way to optimize it that it uses the same join for both?
That would use the same join probably, because you only can, jOOQ only will execute one statement anyway. So it's not Hibernate that does something lazy fetching mechanism. jOOQ does nothing like that. So at the end it has to create one SQL statement and return one result. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I started working with jOOQ for 2 years ago or something, and it was surprisingly for me how powerful it is. So I was, working with GPA, Hibernate, and I saw that everything that I could do also with jOOQ. My question is, last year I started using test containers in my microservices, and I don't know if you are using. I have Flyaway, jOOQ, and I wanted to introduce test containers also to have my integration tests. Do you have such structure, or how do you, or you have only the jOOQ test as you showed? How is your test suite test, I say?
I used, maybe I can show the other project, because there I used jOOQ. I used two test containers. No, that's the wrong project. Let me check that one. And in that case, that's a Vaadin project. So Vaadin has a feature or a test framework. It's called Caribou testing, and it does more or less the same as mock MVC. So it doesn't start a Tomcat, and you have an in-memory, or not an in-memory, you have a mock for Vaadin. And I do all my tests on the end-to-end base, because I don't have anything that should be unit tested, except the calculation of the points. So the rest of the application is just UI code. And here I use test containers as well. So if we have a look at the UI, we have a Caribou base test. And in this Caribou base test, no, it's not I even use it differently. I use test containers directly with this test containers JDBC URL. So this JDBC TC here will spin up a Postgres database. And I use Flyway scripts for the test data and also for the database migrations in that project. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, in one of my old projects, I'm using query DSL, which is, I think it looks the same as the syntax of jOOQ. So I've done the same with joins and projections. But I think query DSL in the background, it uses entity manager and still uses Hibernate. So why, for me, I think the community is community driven, I think, for query DSL. So I don't think there is support anymore. They are trying to develop. So why would, what's the best way to switch from my implementation of query DSL to jOOQ?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't think that there is any automation, but with all these tools that we received recently to transform one code base to another, for example, it may be easy to create a recipe for transforming query DSL queries to jOOQ, maybe. I don't know. I didn't try. Yeah, and you're right, query DSL is no longer active. They merged some PRs and they even made a migration to Jakarta 9 or 10 with the new namespace, but that's it. So they do not actively maintain it.
I asked the developer of the query DSL and he said that it's stable, it's safe, there is a version 5.0, the project was abandoned. That's why I still have not done any upgradation, still using the same.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that their backlog is clear, but still it looks like the project does not have that much support and from the open source community. So that's why, to me, this talk was very interesting to see what alternatives are there in the Java ecosystem for this.
Yes, jOOQ is much more sophisticated. It has many more features than query DSL. And I think the creator of jOOQ is the only person in the world that knows all the SQL databases that exists out there. So he's also the person that files the most issues with databases, probably because he tries to implement a feature or migrate the feature or mimic a feature, and then he finds problems because, for example, this multi-set stuff doesn't work with MariaDB. That was quite annoying because I was invited by MariaDB to do a webinar, and I brought my application and I tried, I can migrate it to MariaDB, and then I want to show that, and an hour before the webinar I noticed that this doesn't work because Maria does not support anonymous derived tables, and they are needed to construct the query. And so Lucas created an issue in the MariaDB issue tracker to support that, but they didn't do that. So MySQL is, better is probably not the right word, but since Oracle took over MySQL, there was nothing happened, and currently probably they can sell it quite good, and they added a lot of features. So MySQL has more features now than MariaDB. So if you use MySQL, this works, but with MariaDB, this doesn't work. So you have to take care. But usually, or what should I say, most of my customers either use Postgres or Oracle databases. Yeah, and they didn't mention that, but jOOQ is not free for commercial databases. So if you use an open source database, then it's free. If you use one of the light databases like Oracle Express or SQL Server Express, then it's relatively cheap, or it's also cheap in the professional version. But if you have Oracle, then you have to pay for it. The reason why Lucas did that is, first of all, he has to live from something, and on the other hand, building the jOOQ abstraction layer of the database, that's a lot of work, because he wants to keep the DSL for all databases the same. And for example, if you have Oracle, you have the connect by, so you can create hierarchical database queries. And this also works with other databases. So jOOQ in the background tries to convert this recursive or hierarchical query to something that the database that you use supports. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Thanks a lot for coming.